Okay, so you guys sent us quite a few articles and reports this time, and it looks like we're going deep on this tragic shooting in Las Cruces, New Mexico.
Yeah, Young Park on Friday, March 21st.
Friday, March 21st, 2025. So just
Yeah.
to be clear for everybody listening, right,
Uh-huh.
we are talking about a mass shooting,
Hmm.
and that's kind of our mission here with this deep dive, right, to take
Yeah.
all of this information and try to sort of synthesize it down into something that's digestible for our listeners.
Right.
And speaking of digestible, it happened at 10 p.m., so late at night on a Friday night, and the sources you sent mentioned an unsanctioned car show.
Yeah, lots of young people gathered, so that seems to be the context.
So maybe jump right into that then. What does unsanctioned actually mean in this case?
Well, typically with a sanctioned event, there would be permits from the city or the county designated organizers, maybe some security measures, somebody kind of looking over everything, making sure it's all safe.
Right.
And so unsanctioned would mean like a lack of that official oversight.
So potentially a little bit more unpredictable.
Yeah, exactly. So less control over traffic and parking and
Right.
and as we've seen here, potential for things to get out of hand.
Yeah, it sounds like that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, there was an altercation between two groups, and it very quickly escalated into an exchange of gunfire.
Okay, so let's start there then. What else do we know about how this altercation unfolded?
Well, like you said, it happened at this unsanctioned car show, and your sources all seem to quote Police Chief Jeremy Story on this. And he says that the investigation so far reveals that there was an altercation between two groups of people,
Okay.
and that altercation escalated to gunfire between both groups.
Between both groups. Okay.
So that seems to be a key detail here, that it wasn't just a single shooter.
Right.
There was an exchange of gunfire back and forth.
Wow. And as we already mentioned, the consequences were absolutely devastating. 3 teenagers were killed, 15 others injured, and looking at the information you sent, those who were injured ranged in age from 16 to 36.
Right.
9 males, 6 females. So
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like it was limited to people who were involved in this initial altercation, right?
Right. It really gives you a sense of the chaos that the gunfire really affected a much wider circle of people who were just at the park that night,
Right.
that it wasn't contained at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about those 3 teenagers who were killed. Your sources identify them as 16-year-old Andrew Madrid and Jason Gomez, although one of the articles initially reported Jason's being 18.
Right. His family actually clarified that he was 17.
17, okay.
Yeah. And then the third victim was 19-year-old Dominick Estrada.
And do we know where they died?
Yeah. Andrew Madrid and Jason Gomez die at the scene.
Okay.
And Dominick Estrada was actually transported to MountainView Regional Medical Center, but he died from his injuries there.
Got it. And, it's just such a tragedy. And I think sometimes when we talk about these things, the numbers can feel a little bit abstract. So I just wanted to point out that Andrew Madrid was a sophomore at Centennial High School, and he played junior varsity baseball. Just to remind ourselves that these are real people with real lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the statistics, but these were young people with, families and friends and futures ahead of them.
Absolutely.
And like you said, Andrew Madrid was involved in school and sports, so it just, it highlights the ripple effect of this loss. His school community, his teammates, they're all feeling this deeply.
Yeah, and beyond those 3 teenagers who died, we have 15 other people who sustained gunshot wounds.
Right. And some of them were treated locally in Las Cruces, but 7 of them had to be transferred to hospitals in El Paso.
Wow.
For more specialized care. So you can imagine the strain that this is putting on medical resources in the region.
Absolutely. So shifting gears a little bit here. Let's talk about the investigation. What do we know about what law enforcement has been able to do so far?
Yeah, well, your sources confirm that 4 suspects have been arrested in connection with the shooting.
Okay.
And these arrests happened over the weekend following the incident, so it seems like the investigation moved pretty quickly in the early stages.
That's good to hear. And do we know anything about the people who were arrested?
Yeah, we have their names and ages. Tomas Rivas, who is 20 years old.
Oh, okay.
And then 3 juveniles, 2 17-year-old boys and a 15-year-old boy.
Wow. So most of the people who were arrested are minors.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. So what kinds of charges are these 4 suspects facing?
Well, they're all facing 3 open counts of murder.
Okay.
And your sources indicate that additional charges may be filed as the investigation progresses.
And just so we're clear on the terminology, what does it mean when a charge is an open count of murder?
Right. So basically it means that the authorities have enough evidence to charge them with murder. but the specific degree of murder, whether it's first degree or second degree or something else, is still being determined.
So it depends on the investigation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It depends on the evidence that's gathered and what they find out about intent and premeditation.
Got it. Okay. And do we know where these 4 suspects are currently being held?
Yeah, Tomas Rivas, since he's an adult, he's being held without bond in the adult section of the Doña Ana County Detention Center.
Okay.
And the 3 juveniles are being held in the juvenile section.
And we don't have their names because they're minors.
Right. Their names haven't been released publicly because of their age.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the events themselves at Young Park. It really does seem like this altercation between the 2 groups at the car show was what triggered everything, right?
Right. And we have that quote from Police Chief Jeremy Story again, saying that the investigation so far reveals that there was an altercation between 2 groups of people, and that altercation escalated to gunfire between both groups. So that back and forth exchange of gunfire really seems to be central to understanding how things spiraled out of control so quickly.
So given that it was between groups rather than like an individual starting to shoot at other people, does that tell us anything about, why this happened?
Well, it definitely suggests some sort of pre-existing conflict, or that things escalated really rapidly between multiple people at once.
Okay.
And that dynamic, it probably contributed to the widespread gunfire and, the high number of people who were hurt.
Yeah, and the reports you sent actually included some details about the physical evidence that was found at the scene. And it really paints a picture of a very chaotic event.
Yeah.
They mentioned that bullet casings were found not just in the parking lot where the car show was happening, but scattered throughout the park.
Wow.
Even extending out toward the street.
So what does that tell you?
Well, to me, it sounds like the exchange of gunfire wasn't static, that people were moving around as they were shooting.
That makes sense.
Maybe even that there were multiple firearms involved.
Right.
Being discharged in different locations. So it definitely makes the forensic investigation more difficult.
Yeah. They're going to have to piece together, the trajectory and source of each bullet.
Right. And as you might expect, Young Park and the surrounding roads were closed off for quite a while after the shooting.
Yeah. All day Saturday and part of Sunday.
Wow.
Yeah. They have to secure the scene, conduct their investigation, and make sure that nothing is contaminated.
Makes sense. And it sounds like this is a really big investigation. It's not just the Las Cruces Police Department that's working on this.
Not at all.
They're getting help from the FBI, the ATF, New Mexico State Police, the District Attorney's Office, the U.S. Attorney's Office. So why is it important to have so many different agencies involved?
Well, in a case of this magnitude, with so many victims and suspects, you really need the resources and expertise of all those different agencies. The FBI has specialized investigative techniques. The ATF can help trace firearms. The New Mexico State Police can provide extra manpower and forensic capabilities. And then having both the district attorney and the U.S. attorney involved means that they can make sure the investigation aligns with both state and federal charges.
Okay. And speaking of the investigation, the reports mentioned that detectives are actively pursuing multiple leads. So it seems like there's a lot of information still coming in.
Absolutely. Yeah, it sounds like it's a very active and collaborative investigation.
Now, in addition to all of that law enforcement activity, your sources also talked about the community's response to this tragedy. There were reports of vigils being planned to honor the victims. Oh. And I was wondering if you could speak to what role those kinds of gatherings play after an event like this.
Yeah, I think vigils are really important spaces for collective grief and remembrance and just support.
Yeah.
It gives community members a chance to come together and mourn the lives that were lost and show solidarity with the families of the victims.
Right.
So it can be a really crucial step in the healing process, just providing a sense of unity and shared purpose in the face of, something so horrible.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also saw some reactions from leaders in the community. Police Chief Story called the shooting a horrendous, senseless act.
Right.
And Democratic House Speaker Javier Martinez issued a statement emphasizing the need to address these kinds of acts of senseless violence.
Yeah, I think these statements really reflect the shock and sorrow that the entire community is feeling. And they also point to this desire to understand how to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
Right. And hopefully those conversations will lead to some positive change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in terms of more immediate support for those who are affected, the reports mentioned that the Community Foundation of Southern New Mexico set up the Las Cruces Crisis Action Fund.
That's great.
Yeah, and I know we see these kinds of rapid response funds a lot after tragedies. So I was wondering if you could just speak to how important they are.
Yeah, they're incredibly important. They provide a way for the community to give money directly to the victims and their families.
Right.
And it helps with those immediate needs like medical expenses and funeral costs and, all the unforeseen financial burdens that come with a tragedy like this.
Right, and it's not just organizations that are stepping up to help your reports. Mention that there were also GoFundMe pages created for the families of Andrew Madrid and Jason Gomez.
Yeah, it's amazing to see people coming together like that. Friends, family, even complete strangers giving what they can to show their support.
Yeah, it's really heartwarming to see that kind of generosity.
It is.
One of the most powerful things that you shared with me when we were preparing for this deep dive was the account of Shaquane Hextall, who was at the car show when the shooting happened.
Oh, yeah.
And he talked about how his military background kicked in when he heard the gunshots.
Mm.
At first he wasn't even sure what the sounds were, but then he recognized them and just immediately jumped into action trying to help people. He was even making makeshift tourniquets out of whatever he could find.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. And, his story really gives us a sense of the chaos and the terror of that night.
Yeah, it shows how people can react with so much bravery and resilience in the face of, extreme violence.
Right.
And the fact that he was making tourniquets out of whatever he could find, it just shows how urgent the situation was and that there wasn't, proper medical assistance available right away.
Yeah, and he actually shared this really heartbreaking detail. He talked about how he interacted with a wounded teenager who was just desperately begging for help for his father.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, that just really underscores the human cost of this tragedy.
Yeah.
The panic, the fear that must have been going through everyone's minds.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that, behind all the statistics, there are real people with real stories of fear and pain.
Yeah, so looking at everything we've learned from the sources you sent, it seems like the picture's pretty clear, right? We have a mass shooting at an unsanctioned car show. 3 young men, Andrew Madrid, Jason Gomez, and Dominick Estrada lost their lives. 15 others were injured. 4 suspects are in custody facing murder charges, and a multi-agency investigation is still ongoing.
Right. And in the midst of all of that, the community is really coming together, to support the victims and their families.
Yeah, it's just a horrific event. And it makes you think about how something like this can happen in a place where people are supposed to be having fun,
Right.
And it makes you think about all the different ways that a community has to respond to something like this, from the law enforcement investigation to the outpouring of support.
Yeah, it's complex.
It's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And I think it raises a lot of questions for all of us. What does it really mean for a community to try to heal and move forward after something this tragic?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
And what can we do to prevent something like this from happening again?
Right.
Those are questions that I think we all need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know that there are easy answers, but I think it's important to keep talking about it.
I agree.
And to keep looking for ways to make our communities safer for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. I want to thank all of you for sending in your reports and for listening.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be back soon with another deep dive into a different topic.
See you next time.
Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.
Bye.
Bye.